Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition and we turn now to poem 520. I started early, took my dog. Now this is one of the only references in all of Emily's poetry about her dog. You'll remember Carlo referenced in 186 and in poem 500 there's the mention of a dog. Carlo was this large black Newfoundland that Emily's father gave to her and apparently was a very close companion. So in this poem we're going to have Emily taking a walk. Now when this poem was published in 1891 it was actually titled By the Sea. Now there's a lot of debate whether Emily actually spent much time by the sea. When we did our series called Chats or Talks with Walt about the poetry of Walt Whitman, we commented that Whitman loved the sea, he was there all the time. It isn't abundantly clear, living in Amherst and being obviously the recluse that she became later in her life, that she ever really spent any time at the sea. So right away, if you're trying to read this poem as somehow autobiographical in regards to Emily's life, it isn't clear. Are we talking about a real sea, or are we talking about some kind of symbolic or metaphoric sea? And we'll obviously get into it. Now, this poem actually appeared in a volume, a little small volume, called Some Emily Dickinson Poems for Children. But, as the great scholar Priest has pointed out, this maybe is only a poem that would be suitable for children in the same way that a Grimm's fairy tale would be suitable for a child. We'll get into why. Now, our assumptions, you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hoping you worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hoping that you've already worked through our preceding 519 poems with us. We just finished with 519, 'Twas Warm at First. And if you have, then you'll be able to place this poem within the context of those earlier poems as we begin our study here. Now, some have read this poem as a possible allegory on life. That is to say, humans are somewhat helpless before the forces of nature, a naturalism that will remind us maybe of Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. Okay. One scholar has pointed out that this poem represents Emily as a hypnotic storyteller, quote unquote. There is a dreamlike quality of this poem, no doubt. It is a deceptively innocent poem, one scholar has called this poem, and some have seen this poem as being actually very much a sexual fantasy. So as we get into this poem, we're going to ask ourselves, what is going on in a poem like this? She says it this way. I started early, took my dog and visited the sea. The mermaids in the basement came out to look at me, and frigates in the upper room extended hempen hands, presuming me to be a mouse, aground upon the sands. But no man moved me, till the tide went past my simple shoe, and past my apron, and my belt, and past my bodice too, and made as he would eat me up, as holy as a dew upon a dandelion sleeve. And then I started too, and he followed close behind. I felt his silver heel upon my ankle, then my shoes would overflow with pearl, until we met the solid town. No one he seemed to know, and bowing with a mighty look at me, the sea withdrew. Now some have suggested that this is a simple poem about a girl who goes with her puppy dog to the ocean and is standing there next to the ocean as the tide is coming in, and it begins to hit her feet and then goes up her legs and that kind of thing, and then she decides to walk back home. But it seems to me that there's something else maybe going on here that Emily is working with, and in that regards we want to pay attention to it. Notice, first of all, we start out early. Okay, we will end, it seems almost as if it's the end of the day, but we start out early. We take, she says, I took my dog, but from this moment on, notice, the dog isn't mentioned. In fact, the only other animal mentioned is a mouse. But there's no mention, for example, at all of what was going on with the dog. For example, was the dog playing in the surf, for example, or in the tide? Interesting. I started early, took my dog. By the way, can I just point out something really quickly? I'll let you do this on your own time later in the Johnson edition, but just take a look. That Emily will, of the 25 nouns of this poem, Emily capitalizes 24 of them. Interesting. Of the subject-object pronouns, 9 out of the 10 are capitalized. Of the 5 of the 6 adjectives in this poem, Emily capitalizes them. But only one of the 19 verbs of this poem, and only one of the 4 adverbs of this poem, does she capitalize. Now, some will argue, man, that's just Emily playing Emily games. Others will say, no, I think Emily's on to something here in terms of what she's trying to specifically address. She visits the sea. Now, it's an easy opening first 2 lines. I went for a walk early with my doggy to the sea. But then the 3rd line injects the only time that Emily in all of her poetry ever mentions mermaids. Now, of course, mermaids have a history in mythology that is ubiquitous, yes? So, for example, when Hamlet calls Ophelia a nymph, or a mermaid, he is calling her not a positive comment, but rather a negative comment. And immediately when we read mermaids, we can't help but think of our study of T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Let Us Go Then You and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient ether ice upon our table, till human voices wake us and we drown, is of course the very last lines of that. I have seen the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. So all of a sudden, she injects this mermaids thing going on, and she says the mermaids in the basement, the basement? Yeah, the basement of the sea. That is to say, this is where the mermaids live, came out to look at me. Notice to look, not to talk, but just to look at me. Strange, no doubt. Some have seen the sea as representative of death. Some have seen the mermaids as representative of the unconscious, maybe even the creative and the destructive potential. You'll remember that mermaids, of course, are stunningly beautiful from the waist up. They are snakes from the waist down. They swim out in the ocean to sailors who are maybe alone and sad on the boat, and call to them to jump into the waters and make love to them, and at the moment of sexual climax, they are drowned. Okay, so that is what a mermaid is. That's the referencing that maybe Emily's playing with. Why would she mention mermaids here? The mermaids came out to look at me and then notice the break. And then from mermaids, we then go to the frigates, right? That is to say the ships out there. In the upper floor, so notice go from the basement to the surface of the ocean, right? Extended hempen hands. Why? Because all of the ropes of the ship are made of hemp. Presuming me to be a mouse aground upon the sand. Now, of course, Emily is always referencing her smallness, her slightness. As we've commented before, she will use the word small in 77 poems, little in 172 of her poems, here emphasizing the fact that she's a mouse aground upon the sands. Strange again. But, now notice, we'll then move to the possibility of a maybe sexual reading of this poem. You guys get to decide this one. But, no man moved me. So notice we go from mermaids now to men. No man moved me, till the tide went past my simple shoe. Now, I think till is an important key word of this poem, because there's a progress of something happening here. In other words, there's a movement from something that will lead to something else, and there's a pivotal moment when it has to happen. In this regards, it is her walk to see the mermaids, or more particularly, for the mermaids to look at her, and then the mention of the tide. Now this takes us back to our previous study of 519. You guys will remember that in our study of that use of the word adamant that we went to 1576, and you'll remember that in that 1576 poem we had this line, the spirit lurks within the flesh like tides within the sea. When we do 1576 later in our study, we'll come back to this again. The tide now. Now notice what the tide does with these 3, can we call them the 3 past? So in other words, she's standing in the tide as the ocean comes in, as the sea comes in. Notice, first, past the simple shoe. Then, past the apron. So what are we doing here? The tide coming up, up, up. Then, the belt, even higher. Finally, past the bodice. Well, remember bodice from our study of 208. In other words, the garment that will cover her chest. So now all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, 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 what's going on? Is she going out into the ocean? Or is she standing there and the ocean is coming to her to cover her up to her chest? And immediately you go, oh. So a literal reading here doesn't work unless she has sat down in the surf. Now some have read this as possibly not the tide, but the fog that would come in off. because of the use of the word silver. And I think you could probably read it that way as well. Either way, something is, can we say, attacking her, or entering her, or surrounding her? Like, what word do you want to use? I mean, you get to decide how you read this. And then dash to dash. In other words, everything's happening kind of simultaneously here. Strange. And, back to the tide, made as he would eat me up. What? I'm sorry, eat me up? Yeah, this phrase, eat me up, is only used once in all her poetry, and it's here. I'm sorry, how is the tide going to eat her up? As, and now an interesting simile, eat me up as wholly as a dew upon a dandelion sleeve. Right? In other words, the same way in which dew or moisture takes over a plant. And then, dash, I started, dash, to. So we're back to the earlier two. What does the word started here even mean? Well, I can't help but think of Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, an apostrophe to the ocean. Remember what he calls the surf there? A pleasing fear, he calls it, a pleasing fear. It's something that scares you, but also attracts you in some strange way. And, she's not finished, he, dash, he, followed, dash, close behind, dash. What? What are you talking about? The sea followed? Well, that makes sense if she's walked out into the ocean, and now she's walking back away from the ocean, and it's still coming at her, because if you've ever been in the surf, you know the way that waves were. I felt his silver heel. Again, some have read this as fog. Some have said this makes sense because of the nature of the waves that are hitting her. Upon my ankle, or back to body parts. Then my shoes, we had the simple shoe before, would, and why that word? Why that word? Notice the shift with the word would. I would circle that word. It's an important moment in the poem. It's almost as if this is perpetual all of a sudden. And we're no longer describing an event from her past. But rather, this seems to happen over and over again. Overflow with pearl. Now the pearl here is significant because Emily loves this word as it relates to that which is hidden, that which is important, and of course the biblical story of the pearl of great price. We've seen this in earlier poems. Until, we're back to the earlier two. Until we met, now who's the we? Is she talking about she and her dog? Or is she talking about her in the ocean, in the sea, or the fog if you read it that way? We met the solid town. Now I think the word solid is not a throwaway word here. In other words, everything has been kind of dreamlike in this poem, and then all of a sudden we hit the solid town. It's like, oh, so now we're back. We're back to something, can we say real? And that makes sense to you? Something real, something physical, something solid. We met the solid town. No one he seemed to know. Then again, the ocean as opposed to the town, right? He seemed to know. And bowing with a mighty look at me. So notice this is the second time we have the look, right? First from the mermaids, now from the sea. Whoever the sea, whatever the sea is. The sea, notice capitalized, withdrew. Notice the phrasing even. At me, dash, the sea, withdrew, dash. What a strange poem. So we start with, early on I arrived at the sea, and the mermaids came out from the basement of the ocean to look at me. And then the sea began to attack me. And so I walked away, but the sea followed me until I got to the town. And then once I got to the town, then it finally withdrew from me and left me. Now, what is this poem about? Well, some will argue it this way. Some experiences are confusing. They are both at the same time pleasant as well as frightening. What if we read this poem, though, as Emily's suggestion of this is what creativity feels like? Now follow me on this, and I hope it makes some sense. If you are a creative person, you have to answer a very thorny question. Where do these ideas come from that you come up with? Ask anybody that loves to draw. Ask anybody that creates music. Ask anybody who loves dance. Ask anyone who creates, and ask, where do the ideas for your creativity come from? How do they approach you? How do the mermaids come out of the basement to look at you? And how do you escape those? How do you promote those ideas in real time, solid down, right? Of course, this creativity can be intoxicating, but it can also be kind of scary, we might argue. The alliteration of the poem, we've commented on this already. It's remarkable, the amount, again, of the capitalization and the like. All of the alliteration: mermaid, me, mouse, man, moved, me. How about till, tide? How about belt, bodice? How about dew, dandelion? How about he, his, heel? How about solid, seemed, sea? And then the assonance as well. Basement came, in stanza 1. Extended hempen, me, be, mouse, aground, in stanza 2. How about he, eat, me, sleeve, in stanza 4. Emily is playing with some remarkable language games here as well. Finally, at 3a, many scholars have related this poem to our study of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn and the power of a work of art, silent work of art, to speak, or Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Both of these, by the way, poems that we studied at learnstrong.net, if you want to run them to ground. The way in which nature has this powerful presence to teach us things. And again, we mentioned Byron's Childe Harold's pilgrimage apostrophe to the ocean of pleasing fear. Finally, at 3a, what was a time that you felt at the same time both pleasure as well as some sense of fear or pain? Maybe reading Emily poetry is doing that for you. Thank you.